is still a political football. How to regulate it, what's going on with it, and the newest of the controversies, obviously, is the vaping crowd, right? They're under attack now. California municipal bans on flavored tobacco at odds with the FDA and Common Sense. Clive Bates, welcome to the Ed Tyll Show on Starcom Radio Network.
Hi, Ed. I'm pleased to be here.
It's great to have you along today. Is it just that people, in your opinion, don't want to hear about tobacco anymore, whether it's safe, whether it's flavored, you got a new way? The brainwashing of the left, of the nanny state, has just stigmatized it, and irrational suppression of free behaviors like vaping are just going to get stomped because, you know, that's the group think.
I think it's complicated. A lot of people would say they're interested in public health and they'd like people to stop smoking, but they'd like to stop them smoking in a particular way, using medicines, using smoking bans, making them just quit completely. So there's a lot of interest, even from the left, in smoking, but in a way of trying to get people to stop smoking. Now, what people like me argue, and I come at this from a public health point of view, is if you can get people to move, by their own choice, by the way, because they want to, because they find it enjoyable, from a product that is extremely harmful to one that is hardly harmful, may not be completely harmless, but hardly harmful, then you've made a huge public health win. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people just don't like that. They just think people should quit completely. They should just get out of it altogether. And what they do is they make the perfect the enemy of the good. Yet we are seeing fantastic progress in the decline in smoking, which is a big win for the public health people, because people are switching from smoking to vaping. And that's something to be encouraged rather than obstructed. And unfortunately, some of the legislators in California and elsewhere are starting to stand in the way of that. And I think that's terrible.
I'm sure you're familiar, as I'm reading your bio now, people can follow along if they'd like to. Go to www.clivebates.com. I'm seeing in your bio that you, up until recently, were a civil servant.
Yeah.
So you get it, right? People in government, whether it's America or elsewhere in the world, the government worker rarely gives a hoot for the citizen. They're never interested in freedom. They're not governments are not interested in individuals. And of course, America proudly likes to shove into the face of the rest of the world, this is where you're a real individual. This is where you can fight back, etc. It's sad, isn't it, that we have this kind of irrational repression, and there's not room for understanding an issue like this better. Is this just world epidemic? Is this the human nature that we're up against? Put them in a government, and they will be small-minded, uninterested the next time we get together.
It would be my great...
Not lithic in their thinking.
I was a civil servant for 13 years, and I served Tony Blair and other British ministers. So I don't think government is all bad. It is guilty of some of the things that you say, though, Ed. I do agree with you. The problem is governments like to get involved. They have a habit of saying, well, there's something new. It can't be right unless I, the government, the civil servant, the minister, have, found a way to regulate it, control it, bring it into the system. They are often very suspicious of anything that looks like the pure private sector. And what's been amazing about vaping is despite the amount of effort and money and difficulty that's gone into trying to get people to stop smoking, here we have what is basically a private sector solution. Innovators and entrepreneurs have come up with products. Consumers have liked them. Consumers have bought them using their own money. No taxpayers have been harmed in the course of this giant experiment. They have switched from smoking to vaping. Their health risks have gone down. Their healthcare costs have gone down. Their contribution to the economy has gone up, and everybody's winning. And then you've got this problem that regulators like the Food and Drug Administration come along and say, well, this can't be right. How can there be something out there that doesn't have our involvement? And they go and start proposing solutions to problems that don't actually exist. And this is the situation we've reached in the United States now. We have got a massive regulatory intervention coming from the FDA that aims to solve a problem that no one can really define. And actually, lots of people are trying to make up. So they'll say, for example, this is a threat to children. But what we've seen is, as the vaping has risen in the adult population and actually in the teenage population, we've seen a dramatic, unprecedented decline in teenage smoking. So teenagers vape instead of smoking, and there's a win for them. It's uncomfortable to say that, but it is actually there in the facts.
You know, the vaping looks new. Is this idea of how vaping works, and maybe you would put that into layman's terms. I've heard it described as steam is created on the inside of the thing that these kids are holding, the box with the tube coming out of it, and that it's the steam that they're taking in, so it doesn't have the tar that you normally get out of a cigarette. Can you put this into layman's terms? What is vaping?
Yeah, that's a pretty good description. So in a cigarette, you take tobacco, dried tobacco leaf, you basically set fire to it.
Right.
That heats up lots of particles, turns it into smoke. You then withdraw those into the lungs. And tobacco smoke is full of thousands of what's known as products of combustion. You set fire to something, you create lots of acrid particles, toxic gases, and so on. That's what you breathe into the lungs, and they are what cause the cancer, the heart disease, the respiratory illnesses, and so on. Totally different approach with vaping. And it's actually, in some ways, it's a spin-off from mobile phone technology, because what's made the difference and why it's happening now is batteries. So you can get a lot of energy and a lot of power in a small battery now, and that is enough to heat up a liquid. So you've just got a liquid. It's made of simple ingredients. It's not steam, it's not water, but it's propylene glycol, which is basically an inert substance. You have nicotine in it, made in pharmaceutical factories, and you have a flavoring in it. You heat that up, and it creates a kind of cloud, or what's known technically as an aerosol. You then inhale that, and you're inhaling a substance that doesn't have these thousands of toxic contaminants, toxic products of combustion. Where these things are, you mostly can't even find these toxicants at all, but where you can, where they're detectable, they're at levels 10 to 1,000 times lower. So people just aren't exposed to the same burden of toxic chemicals as they would when they smoke, but they still get the nicotine and the flavors and the thing to do with their hands and mouth and so on. So people like it. It fits in their life where smoking used to fit, but without all the disease and at a much lower cost. What's not to like?
And how long has it been around?
Well, these products have existed for quite a long time in laboratories, and they started to emerge in the mid-2000s. But essentially, the battery is the thing that makes it. Because it's like the old mobile phones. You know, they weren't that popular to start with because they were about the size of a brick. Well, these things have got smaller and smaller and more elegant, more highly engineered. So they really started to take off in around 2011, have grown very rapidly since then. And as that's happened, we've seen a decline in the rate of smoking in both adults and in teenagers in the United States population, certainly in the UK population and many other places as well.
Sure. So the answer was around 2011, right? About 6 years?
Yeah.
Okay, good. How long is long enough to tell that we're not going to have an alarming news story 15 years from now that all this we just found out today? You know what I mean? Like, it reminds me, you'll recognize this. It's the same thing with climate change. You go with, well, records go back to 1888, and I'm now going to tell you what was happening millions of years ago. You know, the public has a problem with that in general. When we use small data for huge consequential decisions, what is the right time before we know what's happening with this? Like anything else that is about to come to market, how long would you want to see this be benign before you recommended it to your kids or, you know, somebody you cared about?
Okay. So first thing, I would never recommend it to anyone who doesn't smoke, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it to kids. This is for people who are already exposed to very high risk on account of smoking. But to get actually, to your question, this is an argument that people who don't like this use. They'll say, well, the ill health.
I don't think it's because I don't like it. I think it's an honest question. It doesn't have to be from people who don't like it. I think any intelligent person would want to say, how long has this been around? Okay. So I just want to keep it on. I'm not against vaping at all. I don't ask that as, to put vaping down. It's just the common sense of asking if something that does deliver the nicotine and will catch on because people love nicotine, right? Especially blue-collar workers. The richer people get, the less they smoke. You know who smokes in this world? The guys that load the trucks, the hard workers. It's the cheapest relief that they feel they can get curbside while they're doing, physical labor. So, looking out for them, what's a fair amount of time to judge this?
That time is already. Okay, and what I argue on this point is that we already know we don't know everything. We can't know what the situation will be like in 50 years. We don't have a time machine. We can't go back and look at what happened over the next 50 years. We know already that the toxic burden is very low. Just the things that we already know cause all the harm in smoking are just not present or present at very much lower levels. So that, to me, is enough. We've also had 6 years of experience, and we're not seeing anybody keeling over sick. There's no sign of any real harm causing this. But it is possible that there are, as Donald Rumsfeld might have once said, unknown unknowns lurking there in the future. Well, I think,
doesn't everybody have to watch out for what they don't know they don't know? Isn't that good? That's a good caution in life, no matter what you're doing. Don't ever think that you know it. Always be open to that you don't. That's I guess what a lot of people would say about the short timeline. 6 years, 7 years. Do we know what we don't know? Yeah.
We don't know everything, but we do know a lot.
Got it.
So you can't rule out there being, and nobody tries to argue that these things are harmful, that are harmless rather, completely benign. Nobody should argue that. Right. They just argue that compared to smoking, Royal College of Physicians in Britain will say it is likely, so they're being careful, it is unlikely that these products will exceed 5% of the risk of smoking, and the number is likely to be substantially lower than that. Okay, so they're not saying completely safe. They're making an allowance for unknown unknowns. The interesting thing about these products, though, if something does emerge, if we find some ingredient that's causing problems or whatever, you can regulate to take it out. You can't regulate.
But that is kind of using the public as the guinea pig.
No. What this is doing is the other way of looking at it is if you stopped the public having access to these things, you'd be basically saying you're better off smoking until we know for sure. Okay, and actually we know with a great deal of confidence that these things are going to be much less risky. There might be some surprises in there, but it's extremely unlikely that they'll come anywhere near close to the risks associated with smoking. So the trick is just to let people take advantage of the much lower toxicity without implying that these things are harmless, and then say, look, we'll be vigilant. If anything does emerge, we'll modify the product. If cinnamon oil flavor turns out to be dangerous, then we can intervene and say you can't use cinnamon oil flavor. It doesn't mean that you have to hold the entire product category back until in 50 years we literally know everything. And of course, if the products are held back, then you never know anything about them. You've made a decision that you're unwilling to bear the risk. And this is the point. The risk is worth bearing. It's a very, very low risk and very, very high benefits to people who smoke. And therefore, it's a good public health strategy. And we have this all the time with any kind of harm reduction approach. People say, well,
all right, let me ask a question. Let me ask a question. A person takes a drag out of a regular cigarette, and you're standing there, you're watching them. You see X amount of exhale. The amount of steam that comes flying out of these kids is 10, 15, 20 times bigger on a dance floor on a street corner. Why is that cloud so magnified? Why doesn't it resemble? What do you guys know about that?
Well, okay, so there's a type of vaping. I mean, basically, most vapors don't do that. They'll just blow, a tiny little cloud. It's benign. It disappears into the atmosphere. Basically, you can be in a room with 4 or 5 people vaping. To be honest, you will hardly notice it. Some people just think it's cool to blow really large clouds. And if you vape in a certain type of way and you exhale in a certain type of way, you can get a great big cloud. Now, the problem is that looks really spectacular in a photograph. So every time you see it in the media...
Well, I get it personally. I'm experiencing this personally. At work, in offices with the... I guess it was about 2012... In the office, it was the cigarette that went into the side of your PC. The guys who smoked it in our office would have that plastic cigarette, plugged in. Then it became a handheld box. Yeah. So right away, the untrained eye says, this doesn't look the same. Is this cool? Now, you can't blame people for asking that. What do we know is happening there with that huge volume of smoke? Because that is of concern, right? Anybody would be concerned with the size of that cloud coming out. When we say earlier that it's as safe as it can be, are we willing to say it's benign?
No, we don't say it's benign.
So that's right.
The risk to bystanders is extremely low. First of all, most people don't blow clouds like that. They're basically sipping away at these things and they're making discrete little exhale puffs out, and it shouldn't really be troubling anybody. Some people do that, and you see it at vape conventions or people showing off. That's fine. The most of what you can see is basically benign. It's tiny droplets. It's the same kind of substance as theatrical fog, basically. That's what the propylene glycol is. Now, obviously not everybody wants to have that blown over them, but it's not harmful in the way that secondhand cigarette smoke is thought to be harmful. It's just not. It's a completely different substance. It's, as I say, more like theatrical fog. There isn't a sort of burning tip of an e-cigarette like there is with a cigarette that is just, bleeding smoke into the atmosphere. It's all stuff that has been inhaled and then exhaled. And there's really very little to be concerned about. Some people don't like it from a choice, nuisance, sort of irritated by it. But it's not one of these things where you say, well, I'm now exposed to cancer or heart disease from this. It's about etiquette and manners and about making sure that people just treat other people with respect. And I'm very clear on this. I think the state has no role in coming in and banning vaping in public places to control that. That should be up to the owner or operator of a public space. They should decide what the policy is. So if a bar wants to have a vaping room and everybody knows it's a vaping room, then fine, they should be allowed to do that. We don't tend to allow that with smoke, or many places don't allow that with smoking because I think there's too much risk involved. So it's very, very different in the danger that it poses. And hence, it's different in the way that it should be controlled indoors. It doesn't mean people should allow it everywhere. You don't have vaping in nursery schools, in banks, in public buildings that people have to go to. But if you're in a bar and the bar owner, hotel manager wants to allow some vaping in the restaurant, in the bar, that's up to them. I think they should be making that decision, not the legislature.
Clive Bates is our guest. We're talking about the over-regulation of vaping. Cities like San Francisco and others have passed anti-tobacco flavoring ordinances. It says here the FDA has just announced that some tobacco-based products that contain flavorings are actually safer than cigarettes. Can you explain which are and which aren't? It says some products. What are we saying there? Are they actually using the word vape? Do they use a criteria of how much you vape? What are they saying there?
FDA and the legislation calls everything a tobacco product. So even though vaping products don't have tobacco in them, they have pharmaceutical grade nicotine in them, which is different. They still call them tobacco products.
But that's a good question. Could you explain that in layman's terms, what you just said? That they have nicotine, but they're not a tobacco product.
Well, they're referred to in legislation as tobacco products.
Right.
But actually all they have is, nicotine in them. So it's an extract of tobacco. That's where the nicotine comes from.
Okay. Got it. So it's extracted. It is extracted from tobacco. But we're not. So it would be a tobacco byproduct would be technically correct. It's not a product. It's a byproduct.
It's basically the tobacco as a feedstock goes into a pharmaceutical factory and out comes pure nicotine. It's nicotine from the pharmaceutical factory that's added. But basically, FDA's point, it's not the flavor that causes the harm. It's the combustion of the ingredients. So if a tobacco product involves setting something on fire, like it's a cigarette or a little cigar or something like that, then you've got all those products of combustion and they form the toxic smoke which harms the lungs of the smoker. If you don't have combustion, i.e. it's a vaping product, it's a heated tobacco product, it's a smokeless tobacco product that you chew, then you don't get those kind of toxins exposing the body. And therefore, they're very, very much lower. And that includes actual tobacco products like smokeless tobacco. Those products can be flavored, but the flavoring isn't what's causing the risk. It's the combustion.
Got it. I'm a big fan of Manhattan Beach, so I'm glad they're a part of this topic. What would you say if you were speaking to the legislators, the city council of Manhattan Beach, to kind of allay their fear?
I think I make my arguments in several ways. First of all, this is a fantastic public health intervention. If people switch from smoking to vaping, which they are doing by the million across the United States, then that is a huge win in terms of personal health, healthcare costs, return to the economy. Secondly, I'd say a lot of the fears that children are taking these up are misplaced. Kids, the rate of smoking among adolescents is falling at the fastest rate in recent history in the United States, and that's probably because kids are vaping instead of smoking. So kids, even in their experimental phase, are doing something less dangerous. Thirdly, I'd say don't be worried about the secondhand emissions. They are much, much less hazardous than secondhand smoke, and you can allow owners and managers of properties to make the decision. You don't have to intervene. Fourthly, I'd say if you want people to go down this path, then create a fiscal incentive. Don't overtax them. Use the difference in tax rates between cigarettes and vaping to drive people away from smoking and into vaping. That way you'll encourage a big health return to people. You may lose some revenue in state budgets, whatever, but that will that will be beneficial to health and the economy in the longer run. So don't see it as a new threat. See it as a new opportunity, something that is going to help deal with the problem of smoking, and it's going to deal with it through market forces, through people paying for it themselves, through the normal processes of technological innovation, which ultimately is what will obsolete cigarettes. These products will eventually take over because they will offer a better experience with much less risk. Just let that happen. Get out of the way. The main thing you should do is avoid getting in the way of this process, which seems to be working very well.
The term continuum of risk, I have a feeling this is going to be a sliding scale. What do they mean by that when they refer to the continuum of risk, and especially in relation to this particular product?
Well, I think it's a terrible phrase, actually, because I don't know anyone who uses the word continuum in normal everyday life. But by that, what they mean is that at one end of a range of risks, you have cigarettes, and at the other end, you have pharmaceutical nicotine. So this is the continuum of risk across all the products that contain nicotine. Bunched up at the pharmaceutical nicotine end, there are products like vaping, smokeless tobacco, and so on. Bunched up at the cigarette end, there are products like cigars, little cigars, hookah, and so on. And to be honest, it isn't really a continuum. It's more like a discontinuity that appears between products that are set on fire and products that are not, between combustion and non-combustion. But it's referred to as a continuum of risk. And what regulators want to do is to try and encourage people to move from the high risk end of that continuum down to the low risk end of that continuum, or to drop off it completely by quitting.
Excellent. And I want to spend a moment here on your organization called the Counterfactual.
Right.
Tell me about it. Did it come into being over this issue, or were there issues before that brought it about? Tell us about the origin of it.
Well, I've run a blog for many years called the Counterfactual. Since I was a civil servant, since I worked in government, where I basically used it to debate policy ideas. My main interests actually are in sort of energy, environment, sustainability, and that kind of thing. So it was a blog that was focused on that. I then left government, set up my own consultancy, and a variety of clients and variety of sort of business activities, and I use some of that income to pay for my work in this field. I used to be Director of Action on Smoking and Health in the UK, which was the main anti-smoking organisation in the UK, and I regard this harm reduction thing, this idea that there are ways of getting people down into lower risk products, as kind of unfinished business from that era. And I've made, I do it basically to try to get that policy accepted by my former colleagues, who many of whom do now, I'm pleased to say, but many of whom also don't. So I use it as a vehicle for that. And most of the content on my website now relates to that issue. But behind it, I also have a business, which is my consulting business, and I don't have conflicts of interest, so I don't take money from these companies.
Awesome. You probably are aware, California has always been a leader in this kind of nanny state attitude. With your experience in government, and now on a much broader scale talking about this issue, just how dangerous can that be, not just to the voters there, but to progress? Does the California mindset impede progress, in your opinion?
Well, California is up there, but I think Australia would say, hold my beer, if we're going to get into a contest on that. That mindset is very damaging. It's one that holds you in the past. It's the one that gives privilege to orthodoxy. It's one that sees innovation as a threat rather than an opportunity. And you see it all over the place. The response has been it's a mixed picture, Uber, but there's, the response to that in some places has been, people like it. It's upsetting the old order. Right. Let's try and close it down. And I think there is a danger that you rely too much on the state to do everything and not enough on the individual to make their own choices and their own decisions. Okay, the state can play a role, provide information, provide some credible advice. California doesn't do that, actually. The California Department of Public Health does not provide reliable information on the relative risk of smoking, vaping, smokeless tobacco, and so on. It would rather you didn't do any of those things. So it has tacitly misleading campaigns that pretend there's no difference in risk. And of course, a lot of Californians end up suffering from that. They don't think there's any difference in risk. Why would they switch to vaping? Yet it could reduce their risk very substantially indeed. So it's worse even than simply nannying. It's actually being deceptive in the service of a sort of nannying agenda, which I think is really wrong. It's really unethical. It's as bad as the tobacco companies were 30 years ago. If you mislead somebody about the risks of a much safer product with a view to preventing them or obstructing them using it, how is that different to misleading people about the risks of a very dangerous product with a view to getting them to continue using it? It's logically similar. It's morally similar. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in California and other places in the United States.
Clive Bates has had a diverse career in public, private, and the not-for-profit sector. He's joined us today with a revolutionary voice. Do you feel the heat after you do an interview like this and speak as outspoken as you are and as contra to the groupthink? Does your email box just fill up? Does your Twitter get savaged? What's it like to be a revolutionary against the group think society? You must love it. There's got to be a great joy you get, right?
I feel vindicated, basically. I am very clear in my own mind about the science, the uncertainties about this, as we were discussing earlier, Ed, about the ethics of it, about the way that people should have the choice to make these things and not be impeded by state regulation or misinformation. I'm very clear in my own mind about that and have been for many years. I must admit, in 2013, when I started on this road, it was a much more lonely space and much more, you were much more out on your own in 2013 than you are now. Since then, we have bodies, it's over 600 years old, the Royal College of Physicians in the United Kingdom, Public Health England, some of the most senior public health experts in the United States now are coming to see this as the right thing to do. They're being persuaded by the experience of thousands of people, by the scientific evidence that comes in. And I no longer feel like a kind of lone lunatic sort of howling at the moon. I actually feel as though the scientific establishment is moving in this direction and have started to take on these ideas.
That's great, huh? Vaping against the moon, maybe. Listen, it's terrific to meet you and to have this kind of pointed discussion, because I think there's two things at stake here, right? There's always the substance, but there's also the general system of not having to know because the nanny is looking out for me. So thank you for pushing back on both fronts and debunking the myths associated with vaping, and we would love to have you come back on the show. I'm sure there's going to be more progress on this issue, more impact on this issue, but thank you very much for helping us understand it better, and congratulations on standing up. We're in that era again. We're in the era of the rebel and the disruptor. We welcome it, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Ed. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Wow. Get ready, people. We are vaping tonight. It's the Ed Tyll Show. Starcom Radio Network. Clive Bates, a great guest. Go to his website, www.clivebates.com. That's www.clivebates.com. Debunking the myths associated with vaping.